He was Chicago's most ruthless underworld boss, a man who built an empire on blood and silence. She was a struggling catering assistant who couldn't fit into a sample size. But when Victor Santoro fired 10 flawless supermodels just to hire Clara, the city's criminal underworld held its breath. The penthouse boardroom of the Santoro Syndicate, towering high above the gray churning waters of Lake Michigan, was freezing. Victor Santoro preferred it that way. The frigid air kept his men alert and his enemies trembling. At 34, Victor was the undisputed king of Chicago's modern mafia. Beneath the veneer of his legitimate real estate and hospitality, conglomerates lay a labyrinth of extortion, illicit ports, and buried bodies. He wore a bespoke Brioni suit that clung to his broad shoulders, his dark eyes devoid of any warmth, as he stared at the 10 women lined up before him. They were the absolute elite of the Ford Models Agency, flown in from Paris, Milan, and New York. Tall, impossibly thin, and flawlessly contoured, they were there to audition for the face of La Familia Victor's newest, most opulent restaurant venture in the West Loop. The restaurant was supposed to be a tribute to his late mother, a front so squeaky clean that not even the FBI could find a speck of dirt on it. The advertising campaign alone was worth $5 million, yet Victor was bored to the point of violence. "Turn!" he commanded, his voice, a low, gravelly baritone that offered no room for hesitation. The 10 models pivoted in unison, their stilettos clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble floor. They smiled hollow, hungry smiles, batting eyelashes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His underboss, Albert DeLuca, stood by the mahogany door, shifting uncomfortably. Albert knew that look in Victor's eyes. It was the same dead, calculating stare Victor had right before he ordered a warehouse burned to the ground. "They look like mannequins, Albert," Victor murmured, rubbing his temples. "My mother was a woman of substance. She had flour on her apron and fire in her veins. She fed the neighborhood. These women look like they would faint if they saw a carbohydrate. How are they supposed to represent La Familia?" "Boss, they're the top tier," Albert reasoned, quietly adjusting his silk tie. "The PR team says this is what sells. Glamour. Aspiration." "I don't sell aspiration," Victor snapped, slamming his fist onto the glass table, making the 10 models jump. "I sell loyalty. I sell the memory of the only woman who ever gave a damn about me." Outside the heavy oak doors of the boardroom, a completely different disaster was unfolding. Clara Higgins was flushed, sweating, and silently cursing the broken service elevator. Clara was 25, soft-bellied, and decidedly curvy, a far cry from the sleek gazelles posing inside the penthouse. She worked for a small-time, struggling catering company, hired merely to provide coffee and basic craft services for the auditioning models. Her uniform was a size too tight, her unruly chestnut hair was escaping its messy bun, and she had a smudge of powdered sugar on her left cheek. Clara was desperately trying to keep her catering cart from squeaking as she arranged the silver coffee urns. She was exhausted. Between paying off her father's mountain of medical debts and working double shifts, she barely had time to breathe, let alone eat properly. Because she couldn't afford the exorbitant downtown lunch prices, she had brought her own meal in a battered plastic Tupperware container. She had heated it in the break-room microwave down the hall, intending to eat it quickly in the service corridor, before the terrifying men in suits noticed her. She pried the lid off the Tupperware, and the heavy, intoxicating aroma billowed out. It was a rustic, slow-simmered Sicilian ragout, but with a highly unorthodox twist, a dash of roasted fennel, a splash of cheap red wine, and a very specific pinch of dark cocoa powder and orange zest. Inside the boardroom, Victor was mid-sentence, tearing into the agency director, when he suddenly stopped. The words died in his throat. His chest tightened, a violent spasm of memory hitting him so hard he physically swayed. He inhaled sharply. It couldn't be. It was impossible. His mother Katerina had been dead for 15 years, gunned down in a crossfire when Victor was just a teenager. She had taken her secret recipe, the exact meal she made for him every Sunday to the grave. Victor had hired Michelin-starred chefs from Rome to Naples to recreate it, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, but none of them ever got the spice ratio right. They always missed the cocoa. They always missed the orange zest. Albert. Victor whispered, his voice trembling for the first time in a decade. What is that smell? Albert sniffed the air, confused. A coffee boss. Maybe somebody's perfume. No, Victor snarled, pushing his chair back so violently it crashed to the floor. He bypassed the 10 stunned supermodels, ignoring the panicked agency director. He threw open the heavy oak doors. There in the dimly lit corridor sat Clara. She froze her plastic fork halfway to her mouth, her wide hazel eyes terrified, as the towering, dangerous mafia boss loomed over her. She scrambled to stand, nearly knocking over her catering cart. "I'm sorry," Clara squeaked, clutching the Tupperware to her chest like a shield. "I know I'm not supposed to eat on the executive floor. I was just—" Victor stepped into her personal space. He didn't look at her worn-out shoes or her stained apron or the thick curves of her hips. His eyes were locked on the plastic container. "Who made that?" Victor demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "I did, sir," Clara stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew who Victor Santoro was. Everyone in Chicago knew to look at the pavement when a Santoro car drove by. Victor reached out his large, scarred hand, wrapping around her small, trembling one. He pulled the container toward him and took a deep breath. The scent of his childhood, of safety, of a mother's unconditional love, washed over him, completely disarming the ruthless crime lord. He turned his head back into the boardroom. "Albert." "Yes, boss." "Fire them, all of them." Victor ordered, his eyes never leaving Clara's terrified face. "Pay their agency fees and get them out of my building. Now." "But Victor, the campaign." "I said get them out," Victor roared. He turned back to Clara, his expression intensely unreadable. "You. Bring your food. You're coming with me." Clara's legs felt like they were made of wet sand as Victor Santoro escorted her out of the corporate penthouse and into his private armored elevator. The silence between them was suffocating. She clutched her cheap plastic container, convinced she was about to be thrown into Lake Michigan for violating some unwritten underworld rule about smelling up a mob boss's hallway. When the elevator doors slid open, they weren't in a torture chamber. They were in Victor's private residential penthouse kitchen, a sprawling state-of-the-art culinary sanctuary, gleaming with brushed steel copper pots and white marble. It looked completely untouched, a museum to food rather than a working kitchen. "Sit," Victor commanded, pointing to a leather bar stool. He didn't wait for her to comply. He took the Tupperware from her shaking hands, grabbed a silver fork from a velvet-lined drawer, and stood over the kitchen island. Clara watched, her breath hitched, as the most feared man in the Midwest took a bite of her leftover lunch. For a terrifying 30 seconds, Victor said nothing. He closed his eyes. The harsh, deeply etched lines of his face, forged by years of gang wars, betrayals, and street violence, suddenly softened. A single treacherous tear escaped the corner of his eye, catching the recessed lighting before he aggressively wiped it away. The taste was perfect. The bitterness of the dark cocoa, the bright acidity of the orange zest, the rich, slow-cooked depth of the meat. It was Katerina's soul in a bowl. "Where did you get this recipe?" Victor asked, his voice thick, rough with restrained emotion. He opened his eyes, pinning her with an intense, burning gaze. "I grew up in Little Italy," Clara whispered, her hands nervously twisting the hem of her apron. "On Taylor Street, in a really run-down apartment complex. When I was a little girl around 8 years old, there was this sweet older lady who lived across the hall. She was hiding from someone, I think. She never went outside. My mom worked 3 jobs, so the lady used to watch me after school. She taught me how to cook. She told me this was her secret, that the cocoa was to remind her son that life is bitter, but the orange zest was to remind him that it can still be sweet." Victor felt the air rush out of his lungs. He gripped the edge of the marble counter until his knuckles turned white. 15 years ago, during the bloody Castellammares War that had nearly wiped out his family, he had hidden his mother in a run-down safe house on Taylor Street. He had thought she was utterly isolated, completely alone in her final months before the rival hitmen found her. Knowing that she had spent her last days cooking, laughing, and passing her legacy on to this little girl sent a shock wave through his hardened heart. "Her name," Victor said, his voice barely a whisper. "What was her name?" "Mrs. Katerina," Clara said softly, finally looking up to meet his eyes. She saw the pain in them, realizing the truth in an instant. "She was your mother, wasn't she?" Victor didn't answer directly. Instead, he set the fork down and took a slow, deliberate breath, rebuilding the armor around his soul. But as he looked at Clara, her soft, genuine face, her curves that spoke of warmth and reality, rather than the manufactured plastic of his world, something fundamental shifted inside him. "What is your name?" he asked. "Clara." "Clara Higgins?" "Well, Clara Higgins," Victor said, pulling a sleek black checkbook from his suit pocket. "As of this exact second, you no longer work for whatever pathetic catering company hired you. You are the new executive chef of La Familia, and you are the new face of my restaurant empire." Clara's eyes bulged. "Mr. Santoro, I'm not a model. Look at me. I'm a size 14 on a good day. I don't know the first thing about running a high-end kitchen, and I certainly can't be on billboards." Victor walked around the island, stopping mere inches from her. His physical presence was overwhelming, smelling of expensive cologne, tobacco, and danger. He reached out his thumb, gently brushing the smudge of powdered sugar off her cheek. The touch sent a violent jolt of electricity down Clara's spine. "The women I just fired were empty," Victor said, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "You carry my mother's legacy in your hands. You have more beauty and substance in this flower-stained apron than those women have in their entire portfolios. I will hire a sous chef to manage the line. I will hire a PR team to handle the billboards. But you are the soul of this project. Do you understand me?" He didn't give her a chance to refuse. Within 48 hours, Clara's life was unrecognizable. She was moved out of her cramped, moldy studio apartment and into a luxury suite in the Santoro Tower. Her father's crippling medical debts were magically paid off in full by an anonymous philanthropic trust. Clara spent her days in the pristine test kitchen of La Familia, cooking alongside Victor, who began to visit her daily. The ruthless mob boss would roll up his custom silk sleeves, put on an apron, and chop onions beside her, laughing for the first time in a decade. A slow, terrifyingly deep romance began to simmer between the hardened criminal and the soft-hearted civilian. But in the Chicago underworld, weakness is blood in the water. Word spread rapidly across the city's dark underbelly that the impenetrable Victor Santoro had developed a strange, reckless obsession. Across town, in a cigar-smoke-filled speakeasy on the south side, Carlo Marchesi slammed his glass of bourbon onto the table. Carlo was the brutal patriarch of the rival Marchesi syndicate, a man who had been looking for a vulnerability in Victor's armor for 5 years. "You're telling me," Carlo sneered, looking at his top lieutenant, "that the Ghost fired 10 international supermodels, derailed a $5 million PR campaign, and handed the keys to his new fortress to a chubby baker from Taylor Street." "That's the word on the street, boss," the lieutenant replied. "He's got a security detail on her 24/7. He eats with her every night. He's soft for her." Carlo's scarred face twisted into a vicious, yellow-toothed smile. "Victor Santoro thinks he can play house. He thinks he can have a civilian pet while sitting on my territory's shipping routes." Carlo leaned forward, the ice clinking in his glass. "Find out everything about this Clara Higgins. Where she walks, who she loves, where her sick father lives. Victor wants to remember his mother good. We're going to make sure this little baker meets her." The storm was gathering, and Clara, surrounded by the intoxicating warmth of Victor's kitchen, had no idea she had just become the most high-value target in Chicago. The billboards went up on a Tuesday, casting long, vibrant shadows over the magnificent mile. They did not feature the skeletal, hungry-eyed supermodels the industry was accustomed to. Instead, towering above the Chicago skyline, was Clara Higgins. She was photographed in the warm, golden lighting of a rustic kitchen, wearing a pristine white chef's coat that hugged her generous curves perfectly. Her chestnut hair was loose, catching the light, and her smile was radiant, genuine, and deeply inviting. Beneath her image, the bold, elegant text read simply, "La Familia." Real food, real heritage. The city's elite went into an absolute frenzy. The fashion agencies scoffed, calling it a PR disaster, but the public reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The reservations line for La Familia crashed within 3 hours. People were utterly captivated by the mystery of the beautiful, normal-looking woman who had somehow charmed the notoriously icy Victor Santoro. Inside the fortified walls of the restaurant's kitchen, entirely shielded from the media storm, Clara was thriving. It was late into the evening, long after the prep staff had gone home. The stainless steel counters gleamed under the dim security lighting. Clara was experimenting with a new reduction sauce, the heavy scent of balsamic and roasted garlic filling the air. She wore comfortable clogs, and her favorite apron humming softly to herself. She didn't hear Victor enter until she felt the heat of his massive frame standing directly behind her. "You're working too late," Victor murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her spine. He wore a charcoal suit, but his tie was discarded, the top buttons of his shirt undone to reveal the faint edges of dark tattoos sprawling across his chest. "The grand opening is in 4 days, Victor," Clara said, turning around. She bumped gently into his chest, her breath catching as she looked up into his dark, intense eyes. "I need the veal just to be absolutely perfect. It has to honor her." Victor's gaze softened a look reserved strictly for her. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn velvet box. "My mother didn't care about perfection, Clara. She cared about passion." He opened the box. Resting on the faded silk was a delicate vintage gold chain holding a small, ruby-encrusted cross. She was wearing this the day she died. I swore I would only give it to the woman who brought life back into my family's name. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Victor, I can't. This is too precious." "You are precious," Victor corrected fiercely, his large hands reaching around her neck to clasp the cool gold against her skin. He let his fingers linger on her collarbone, his thumb tracing the pulse racing at her throat. The tension that had been building between them for weeks finally snapped. Victor leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that was desperate, hungry, and completely consuming. Clara melted into him, her hands gripping the lapels of his expensive suit, anchoring herself to the most dangerous man in the city. But outside this sanctuary, the trap was already set. The next afternoon, while Clara was finalizing the seating chart in the restaurant's office, her cell phone vibrated. The caller ID flashed the number of the physical therapy clinic, where her father Thomas was recovering from his latest surgery, a luxury facility entirely paid for by Victor. "Hello," Clara answered, a smile still lingering on her lips from Victor's morning kiss. "Miss Higgins," a panicked female voice said. "This is Nurse Davis at Oakwood Recovery. I'm so sorry to call like this, but your father has collapsed. He's unresponsive. The paramedics are rushing him to Mercy Hospital right now. You need to get here immediately." Clara's blood ran ice cold. "What, no? That can't be right. I saw him yesterday. He was fine. Please, Miss Higgins, they're doing CPR. You have to hurry." The line went dead. Panic, blinding, and absolute hijacked Clara's brain. She dropped the seating charts. She knew she was supposed to alert Paulie, the hulking, armed bodyguard Victor had assigned to stand outside her door, but Paulie had strict orders from Victor to follow a rigorous security protocol, to call in motorcades and secure routes. That would take 20 minutes. Clara didn't have 20 minutes. Her father was dying. Operating on pure adrenaline, Clara grabbed her coat and slipped out through the kitchen's freight elevator, a route the staff used for garbage disposal that bypassed the main security checkpoint. She burst out into the damp, narrow alley behind the restaurant, sprinting toward the street to hail a taxi. She never made it to the sidewalk. Two massive figures stepped out from the shadows of a commercial dumpster. Before Clara could even scream, a calloused hand clamped violently over her mouth. The suffocating chemical stench of chloroform flooded her nostrils. She thrashed wildly, her heavy kitchen clogs kicking at her attackers, but they were too strong. As her vision blurred and the world faded to black, the last thing she felt was the cold gold of Katerina's cross resting against her collarbone. 20 minutes later, Victor Santoro walked into the restaurant office carrying 2 cups of espresso. He found the room empty, the seating charts scattered across the floor. A cold, terrifying dread coiled in his gut. He stepped out into the hallway. "Paulie." "Boss." Paulie jogged over, looking confused. "She's still inside, right?" Victor didn't answer. He turned and sprinted toward the kitchen, his eyes scanning the space until they landed on the open freight elevator. He rode it down to the alley. There, lying in a puddle of stagnant water, was Clara's cell phone. Albert DeLuca stepped into the alley a moment later, his gun already drawn, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. He looked at Victor, and a chill went down the underboss's spine. The man standing in the alley was no longer the man who had been laughing and cooking veal. The warmth was gone, replaced by a dark, murderous void. The ghost of Chicago had returned. "Albert," Victor whispered, his voice sounding like cracking ice. "Mobilize the men, empty the armories, lock down every bridge and tunnel in this city. If Carlo Marchesi has harmed one hair on her head, I will paint the streets with his blood." The cold was absolute, seeping through Clara's bones and rattling her teeth. She woke up tied to a heavy steel chair, the harsh fluorescent lights of an abandoned meatpacking plant blinding her. The smell of rust-old copper and freezing ammonia made her stomach churn. Standing 10 feet away, smoking a thick Cuban cigar, was Carlo Marchesi. He was surrounded by 6 heavily armed men. "Look who's awake," Carlo sneered, walking toward her. He grabbed her chin, roughly examining her face. "I gotta admit, I don't see the appeal. You're soft. You're a civilian. But my guys tell me Santoro looks at you like You're the Virgin Mary." Clara didn't cry. She was terrified, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But she remembered the Taylor Street apartments. She remembered the debt collectors who used to bash on her father's door. She knew how to look a monster in the eye. "He's going to kill you," Clara said, her voice shaking but defiant. Carlo laughed, a booming, ugly sound. "No, sweetheart. He's going to sign over the South Side ports, the unions and the trucking routes. Because if he doesn't, I'm going to put a bullet in your pretty little head and send him the video." Carlo pulled a burner phone from his coat and dialed Victor's private number. It answered on the first ring. "Carlo." Victor's voice came through the speaker. It wasn't angry. It was terrifyingly calm, flat and hollow. "Listen to me, Santoro," Carlo gloated. "I have your little baker. If you ever want to taste her cooking again, you're going to hand over the waterfront. No lawyers, just you the deeds and my men at the docks." "Carlo," Victor repeated softly. "Did you look outside before you made this call?" Carlo frowned. He gestured to one of his men, Tommy Knuckles Sullivan, to check the frosted, grime-covered windows of the warehouse. Tommy wiped the glass, peered out into the darkness, and immediately took a staggering step back. "Boss!" Tommy choked out his face, draining of color. "There are black SUVs everywhere. They've surrounded the block." Before Carlo could process the information, the warehouse plunged into pitch blackness. The power had been cut. Clara screamed as the heavy steel doors at the front of the warehouse were blown completely off their hinges with a deafening, concussive blast. Tactical flashlights pierced the darkness, attached to the barrels of automatic rifles. Chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed off the corrugated metal walls, deafening and bright. Clara squeezed her eyes shut instinctively, throwing her weight violently to the left, toppling her chair over to make herself a smaller target. She heard men shouting, bodies hitting the concrete floor. Above the din, she heard the distinct, terrifying roar of Victor Santoro. "Hold your fire, she's on the floor." Suddenly, the backup emergency generators kicked on, bathing the warehouse in a dim red light. Carlo Marchesi, bleeding from a graze on his shoulder, realized he was entirely outmatched. His men were either dead or disarmed on the floor. In a desperate, cowardly move, he lunged toward Clara, pulling a serrated combat knife from his belt, intending to grab her as a human shield. But Clara wasn't a fragile model. She was a woman who hauled 50-pound sacks of flour for a living. As Carlo lunged, Clara rolled hard, swinging her tied legs outward. Her heavy steel-toed kitchen clogs smashed directly into Carlo's kneecap. The mob boss howled in pain, his leg buckling his momentum, stalling for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Victor needed. A single gunshot rang out, echoing with terrifying finality. Carlo Marchesi dropped dead, a bullet perfectly centered between his eyes. Victor stood 20 feet away, his customized pistol still raised smoke curling from the barrel. His suit was ruined, his face splattered with blood, his chest heaving. He dropped the gun and crossed the room in 3 massive strides, falling to his knees beside Clara. He pulled a switchblade and slashed through her thick plastic zip ties in seconds. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her chestnut hair, his massive frame shaking. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" he demanded, his hands frantically checking her face, her arms, her neck stopping when his fingers brushed the gold cross. "I'm okay," Clara sobbed, burying her face into his blood-stained shirt, gripping him, as if letting go would mean falling off the earth. "I'm okay, Victor." "I'm sorry," Victor whispered, pressing his lips to her forehead. "I brought you into this darkness. I should have kept you far away from me." Clara pulled back, looking directly into the eyes of the ruthless killer who held her like she was glass. You didn't bring me into the darkness, Victor, she said fiercely. You brought me home. 3 days later, La Familia opened its doors. It was the social event of the decade. The city's elite politicians and celebrities packed the dining room desperate for a taste of the legendary menu. Clara emerged from the kitchen, not in a chef's coat, but in a breathtaking emerald green silk gown that cascaded over her curves like liquid glass. Around her neck, Katerina's ruby cross caught the chandelier light. Victor stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, waiting for her, looking devastatingly handsome in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. As she descended, the entire room went silent. He offered her his hand, ignoring the flashing cameras of the society press. He didn't care who saw them. He didn't care about the whispers of his underworld empire. The man who had lived his entire life in the shadows was stepping into the light, completely captivated by the woman who had saved his soul with a pinch of cocoa and orange zest. He pulled her close, kissing her softly in front of the entire world, declaring silently, permanently, that the King of Chicago had finally found his queen. Did you expect that explosive twist at the warehouse? Clara proved she is far more than just a talented chef. She has the heart and bravery of a true mafia queen. If you loved this intense mix of culinary passion, high-stakes underworld drama, and a romance that defies all the odds, please hit that like button. Share this incredible story with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, pulse-pounding romance stories.